All right, so time for an old dog to learn new tricks here, and I'm shooting this video on my computer to because I have a diagram here and I want to work through this with you. I went racing a couple weeks ago, and our race car had some issues, and so Friday during test and tune, I had the car out on track and it was running great, and then we started having fuel starvation at the end of the straightaways, and we pulled the car into the pits, and I'm being the chief mechanic at the racetrack. I dove in there. We've got a zipper on fuel pumps. I was able to get in and get them replaced really quick. Uh, it wasn't a goal for me to become really good at them. It's just we've had a lot of issues with them in the past, and we've made it to where we can change out a fuel pump really quick. We had a spare fuel pump ready to go immediately. Whenever the car came in, the first thing I did was I pulled the fuel pump out, and it's not shown here. I suppose I need to run through this real quick. This is my diagram of the fuel system in our car. We have our fuel cell in the back. You've got a vent line here that goes through a loop to a vent. The loop is so that if you slosh fuel back and forth, the fuel might go up a ways, but your fuel pump is always sucking fuel out of the tank and air's got to go back in. So you're not going to slosh fuel right out. You might get it to go up into this loop a little bit. There's our vent line. We have a Holley hydromat in the bottom of the tank so we can get every bit of fuel out. There's the suction line to the fuel pump. And if you'll notice, this makes a really nice siphon. It goes up and down. The fuel pump is mounted at the same level or lower as the bottom of the tank. That way it can get a siphon effect. And if you mount your pump up high, then it's constantly sucking the fuel and there's no siphon effect to help it. So if you're down near the bottom of the tank, this fuel pump has to raise this fuel up 12 inches before it gets to it. Puts a lot of strain on the fuel pump. We burned up a few fuel pumps before we learned that you're supposed to mount them low like this. So we have a nice drop to help draw and siphon the fuel out of the tank to the fuel pump. Not shown here, there's a little filter on the inlet of the fuel pump. It's basically just a screen. The fuel comes out of the fuel pump to the fuel filter, the stock fuel filter for the car. We're running under the passenger side. Then the fuel goes on up to the injectors. You go through your rack of injectors, and on the back end, you'll have a fuel pressure regulator. And this is pretty common on all cars, all fuel injected cars. I believe this is around 60 psi. It's a Bosch fuel injection system. I've never taken a fuel pressure reading from it actually. At the racetrack, it's pretty much, we're throwing parts at it trying to get it back on track. We don't usually do in-depth diagnosis with, oh, what's our fuel pressure at, so on and so forth. So your fuel pump pushes the fuel and develops 60 psi, and you have a spring-loaded restriction here, and anything over 60 psi gets vented into the return line and dumped back into the pump. So at the track, when we were starving at the end of the straightaways, we knew that we had a problem with getting the fuel to the injection system. We had trouble developing 60 psi here at the end of the straightaway. We were drawing enough fuel through the engine at high RPM at full throttle that it was starving out. So we also went and got a new fuel filter, installed a new fuel filter on the car. We typically keep one spare, but we didn't have a spare. We'd already used it. Uh, when our team captain ran to the parts store, they only had one filter. We would have restocked our spare, but we didn't get to. So we put the new filter on the car. I pulled the fuel pump out, replaced it, and while I had it out, I pulled the filter off the end of the fuel pump, the little screen we had, and I blew through it, and a wad of gunk came out in my hand. So we figured we'd found the problem, put it back together, got the car back on track, and it ran great for a while. But then our symptoms changed. We weren't running out of fuel at the end of the straightaway. All of a sudden, we had an issue with coming out of corners, the car would stumble. You'd mash on the gas pedal, and there would just be nothing. It wasn't a lack of power, it was a complete loss of power, of almost the engine dying out. And then all of a sudden, it would kick in and run strong to the end of the straightaway. Um, so and this was during the race on Saturday. We started the race about an hour or two into the race. We were in first place out of 109 cars. So we were really doing good, better than we've ever done with this car, and we were excited. And then once the car started getting below about a half a tank, we started having this issue with it. Coming out of the corner, it would start stumbling. And typically we have data stream on the car in the pits. We have a cell set up. If you'd like to hear more about that, got to give a shout out here to Matt Murphy and the Racers HQ podcast. He's on our race team, great guy, runs a podcast where he talks about amateur racing stuff. And he and I believe it was Roland talked a bit the other day about the issues we were having with the telemetry in the car. Basically, the cell phone network that we run the telemetry from wasn't able to handle that. And so typically we can see the fuel pressure, we can see the fuel lambda, see whether we're running rich or lean, and we can see the engine temperatures. The drivers, we were all keeping an eye on the temperature gauge. The engine wasn't getting hot, but we were concerned that if we were running lean on the straightaway at full throttle, we could burn a piston. So all Saturday, we if we ran with the engine with the fuel cell full, it would run better. But once the fuel got below 3/4 or below half a tank, especially below half a tank, we would start getting the popping and misfiring coming out of the corner. Um, Saturday evening, I dove into the fuel cell. I pulled it all the way apart, pulled the bladder out of the fuel cell, which the bladder is not pictured here, but you have a rubber bladder inside of here that's deformable. So if you get rear-ended and it crushes the fuel cell, the fuel bladder deforms and keeps the fuel from leaking out. But I pulled the bladder out, cleaned it out. I found a roly-poly in the fuel cell. And now, how does a roly-poly get in your fuel cell? I don't know. We have a filter on the end of the vent line, so it's not like the roly-poly is going to crawl up that. And we're not in the habit of leaving the filler neck out, or the filler cap out of the fuel cell. So not sure how we got a roly-poly in there, but I got him cleaned out and checked the fuel screen on the fuel pump again, and it was clean. So we put the car, or I put the fuel cell back together, and Sunday we got out racing again, and still the same issue. Coming out of a corner with anything less than 3/4 of a tank, and it was getting worse. It would start misfiring, and we couldn't figure out what it was. Halfway through the day, we'd all had a couple hours of seat time in the car, so we were all happy with how the weekend was going, even if we weren't winning. And we decided, just in case, we didn't want to hurt the engine, we parked the car, and a half hour from the end of the race, we fired the car up, got it back on track just so we could take the checkered flag. Um, but after the race, we actually had two cars on our team at this race, and one of the drivers from our B team came over and was talking to us and said, "Hey, what's this thing hanging on the back end of your car? Because I saw fuel coming out of it on track." Well, that was a clue. We didn't know that, and another team verified for us also, um, and that got me to thinking. And a day later, Monday morning, we dropped the car off, and we were still on our way home from the race because it's a long tow for us. Uh, Stopped for breakfast, and I'm sitting there eating my breakfast, and it dawned on me: if we have a break here, our fuel pump is sucking. It's trying to suck the fuel out. And if it's sucking air in here, then it's going to pressurize this with air. Now, normally when you're drawing fuel out of the tank to pressurize the system and you have excess that goes back into the tank, you're not putting back into the tank any more than you're drawing out of the fuel cell. But if you have a cut after the fuel cell, or a break in the line, a leak after the fuel cell, you're going to draw air in, and you're pumping that air into the fuel system along with your fuel, and all of a sudden you're pressurizing your fuel cell. And if you have fuel slosh in a corner, that pressurized air is going to pump the fuel out of your vent line. And that's what our teammates were seeing, was the fuel getting pushed out of the fuel cell by the air going into the fuel cell. So typically, when you're running with a normal system, this is closed, whatever is getting vented out of the tank, or vented back into the tank from the relief, is what's already been sucked out of the tank. So you're not taking outside air and pumping it into the cell. You're drawing everything from inside the cell and returning it back into the cell if it's not used by the engine. Anything that is used by the engine is being replaced with air from the vent line. Got a break here. You're sucking air through the vent line, but you're also sucking air in here. Now, why did we not have this problem until we had a less than 3/4 of a tank? Well, if you have a full tank or 3/4 of a tank, you're not putting a huge suction on this line. You don't have a whole lot of inches of draw. But if you're down to half a tank, all of a sudden you're drawing this fuel up 8, 12 inches, and that puts more stress on this break here. And so you're going to draw more air in. And this was borne out when our team captain got the car back to Dallas and started working on it. He pressure tested the fuel vent line, or the fuel supply line from the cell to the pump, and the AN fittings here weren't sealing quite right. He pressure tested this line and it didn't hold pressure. And so that verified that somewhere between that where that bolts on the top of the tank and where it goes to the filter, one of these ends, it was sucking air, and that's what we were pumping into the tank, causing us to vent fuel. So understanding the physics of how this stuff works, having more knowledge of physics and understanding how vacuum works and understanding how a siphon works, this is important if you're going to be diagnosing fuel systems. Um, I just can't stress enough, as a mechanic, you know, memorizing that this usually means that works kind of, but sometimes you have to extrapolate from the data you have where the problem could be without necessarily knowing it's usually this problem whenever we have this problem. We've never had this problem before. We've never had a crack. Well, we may have, but I don't recall. We've never had this problem where we were pushing air into the tank and venting fuel out. But putting the clues together in my head and thinking of the physics of it and understanding how the system's laid out, and this is a pretty standard fuel system on a modern car. Understanding that helped me come to with the clues I needed to figure out where the problem was. And I made the statement, hey, let's check this stuff, and that's why those lines got pressure tested. So think this stuff through. So I hope you got something out of that, and I hope you enjoyed watching the video, and thank you for watching.